Then there's going to be 4 videos on the papal encyclical called Casti, and that just means on Christian marriage. It was written about 100 years ago by Pius the 11th, Pope Pius the 11th. It's really beautiful, and he walks through 4 things that he's going to address. He's going to address the bond and the authority of that bond. So the consent, the I do, and when someone is bonded and when they are not bonded, and who has the authority to bond a couple and who doesn't. That's the video that this one is going to be. So this video will be on the bond and the authority. Then the 2 other videos on Casti, or the 3 other videos on Casti Connubii, are offspring, and then mutual support, which is also called conjugal fidelity, and then the sacramental nature of matrimony. So we're going to go ahead and dive in now to Casti Connubii. This is the first video on Casti Connubii. And I'm just going to go ahead and do some commentary on different sections. I do encourage you to read the entire encyclical. I don't know, it could take 3 or 4 hours to sit down and read it and think about it and pray about it. But hopefully this video can sum up, or these 4 videos on Casti Connubii will sum it up for you. So the first section is section 1. Right off the bat, the Pope is going to do a beautiful job of really defining marriage for us. And again, you know, the bond and the authority. So who has the authority to define marriage? This is God's institution. So the church is the one that defines marriage. That's very important. The state doesn't have that right, and the couple doesn't have that right. So the Pope says, Jesus Christ ordained Christian marriage as the principle and foundation of domestic society. He raised it to the rank of a truly and great sacrament of the new law. He restored it to the original purity of the divine institution. He entrusted all its discipline and care to his spouse, the church. There's a saying that says, society will go as the family goes. And I guess you could take that further, that family will go as marriage goes. So as the Pope points out here, Christian marriage is the principle and foundation of domestic society. If we want a good society, if we're tired of how society is crumbling around, then we need to fix marriage. We need to go to family and marriage. Society goes as family, family goes as the marriage. Jesus Christ elevated this natural institution. He elevated it to the level of a sacrament. There are only 7 sacraments. This is one of those sacraments. I want to jump in here to the fact of the authority that is involved. Who has the authority over marriage? Well, since marriage is a sacrament, the church has authority over all sacraments, including this one. We'll talk about that again on the 3rd point. He restored it to its original purity all the way back to the divine institution. So when you look through the history, especially in the Old Testament, we see that marriage, there's obviously attacks against marriage and problems with marriage. There's polygamy, there's concubines, all this type of stuff. And even in our own day, we see definite problems with marriage. But Jesus is going to take us all the way back to the beginning. In fact, in Matthew 19, when he's asked about marriage, he's particularly asked about divorce, he says, this is not what God intended in the beginning. So he goes all the way back to Genesis, particularly Genesis 1 and 2, and he takes us back to the original purity. In other words, what did God intend when God founded this institution? Jesus does that. He goes all the way back. And so we're going to be doing that, of course, through these lessons. And then Jesus Christ entrusts this great institution, this divine institution, this blessed sacrament of holy matrimony. He entrusts this. He gives this over to his apostles. The apostolic succession continues this. So it is the church that is the supreme caretaker of marriage, even as an institution and as a sacrament. So we'll kind of make a distinction there. This is an institution and divinely instituted all the way back from the beginning, and it's also a sacrament. The institution and the sacrament are handed over to the authority of the church, and so the church is the supreme authority on planet Earth regarding the institution and the sacrament of matrimony. Section 5, let it be repeated as an immutable and inviolable fundamental doctrine that matrimony was not instituted or restored by man, but by God. Not by man were the laws made to strengthen and confirm and elevate it, but by God, the author of nature, and by Christ our Lord, by whom nature was redeemed. And hence, these laws cannot be subject to any human decrees or to any contrary pact, even of the spouses themselves. So here I want to stress the fact that it's not man that makes the rules about marriage. Man did not institute this. Matrimony was not instituted or restored by man. So God has the complete authority over marriage as an institution. Jesus is God, and Jesus established a church. So the church then, if you look back to what Jesus said to his apostles, he said, "As the Father has sent me, I send you." He was saying that to the apostles. This is an apostolic church. Through the Catholic Church, we have the apostolic succession. So Jesus was giving this institution over to the church. Again, as we already said, they are the caretakers. So the church is the caretakers. We don't get to make the rules. Man or the state does not get to make the rules. If you see the diagram, it's not the couple that decides what the bond is, and the couple doesn't even bond themselves. And it's not the state that decides what the bond is or gets to define that. It is truly God that gets to do that. Jesus is God. Jesus established a church. And so therefore, the church is the supreme authority regarding this institution. This is sacrament. And so any human decrees or any contrary pact, marriage is not subject to those things. We have to follow exactly what God has intended with this institution, but also with this sacrament. The Pope here is going to go all the way back and helping us kind of define what is the consent, what is the pact that this man and this woman are making. He's going to go all the way back to Thomas Aquinas, and then we'll see in just a second that he's going to go back even further to St. Augustine. So in section 6, he's going to quote St. Thomas Aquinas. So this is Thomas Aquinas saying this: "These things, conjugal honor and offspring, are so contained in matrimony by the marriage pact itself that, if anything to the contrary were expressed in the consent which makes the marriage, it would not be a true marriage." So what makes a marriage is the consent of the man and the woman, the I do, the consent. And so if they consent to what God intends, the institution, the sacrament, if the two, man and woman, consent to God's intention, then it definitely is a true marriage. If they consent to anything else, or they are lacking to intend what God intends, then it is not a marriage. It would not be a true marriage. So everything does hinge on the consent of the man and the woman, the I do. This is so much true that you can kind of think of this in regards to cooking something or baking something. If you were to have 6 ingredients go into a bowl for a recipe, let's say I'm making chocolate chip cookies, and I have to put chocolate chips and sugar in there, but I don't. I put flour, I put milk, I put eggs, but I do not put chocolate chip cookies or sugar into the mix. Then you could say to me, those are not chocolate chip cookies. They never have been, they never will be. So in the same sense, there has to be certain elements that are present for it to be a true marriage. And those elements have to be present at the time of the consent. This has to be what the man and the woman are consenting to. So what are those elements? Thomas Aquinas says that they are conjugal honor. Now in the graphic here, that conjugal honor is going to be mutual assistance, or also called conjugal fidelity. So there has to be the express consent to mutually assist each other during this life until death. This is where we say to have and to hold, in rich and poor, good times, bad times, in health and sick. So another thing that has to be intended with the consent is an openness to life. So offspring, the procreation and education of children. If a man and a woman, when they consent, when they enter in, if they do not intend those two things, then it is not a true marriage. And in fact, I guess one way you can think of this is there is either a bond or there never was a bond. Just like there either is chocolate chip cookies or there never were chocolate chip cookies. And talking about this consent and the express intention to enter into this consent, the bond is really going to include the will of God and the will of man. And in section 9, Pius XI speaks perfectly about this. True marriage, so we're talking about here the consent, true marriage is constituted both by the will of God and the will of man. From God comes the very institution of marriage, the ends for which it was instituted, the laws that govern it, the blessings that flow from it, while man, through generous surrender of his own person made to another, for the whole span of life, becomes, with the help and cooperation of God, the author of each particular marriage, with the duties and blessings annexed thereto from divine institutions. So, very simply put, what is God's role? God, the will of God is that he is completely in charge of this institution. It comes from him. So you could say he is the author of the institution. He also keeps the institution in existence. So he is the founder, the author. He started it all. He keeps it going. He determines all the laws governing it, meaning not only defining it, but how it will be regulated, and then all the blessings that will be given through this. And that is just so beautiful. That's what God gives us. In all of the 7 sacraments, he's going to do the same thing. He's going to institute them. He is going to determine all the laws that flow from them, or give that to the church to do throughout time. And then also all the blessings and graces that's going to come from it. So that's all God's part. You can say that God is, in his will, he wills marriage to be, to exist. He started it, he keeps it in existence. He did not take marriage away from us after original sin. He didn't snag marriage away from us. Also, after the flood, he didn't take marriage away from us. In fact, he keeps marriage going. And so then what is man's part? So God's part is he wills that marriage will exist. He is over marriage itself. But particular to each marriage is that man and that woman. So the way you can see this is, who is over marriage itself? God. Who is over my marriage? Well, that would be myself and my wife, Angela. So what's my will? What's the will of man? I get to determine whether I will enter into his institution, his sacrament, and who I will enter into it with. That's my will. That's my choice. Do I want this or not? And yes, of course I do. If you're engaged, do you want to enter into this institution, this great sacrament that God has set the rules for? And then who do you want to enter into this with? There are 8 billion people on the face of the earth. So if you're engaged right now, you are choosing one woman out of 4 billion. So you're choosing that. What's your will? You're willing to enter into with that particular person for life, into an institution that God has given you. It's so beautiful, really, when you think of it that way. So the man's will is over the particular marriage, and then God is over, of course, all marriages. So I said before that Pius the 11th is going to go back to Thomas Aquinas, but now he's going to go even further back to St. Augustine. And St. Augustine outlines here what is going to flow from the bond. So we talked about the bond is what God bonds two people together. The consent must be there. These are all the blessings that are, again, going to flow from that consent that I do, that marriage. These are the blessings of matrimony, on account of which matrimony itself is a blessing. Offspring, conjugal faith, and the sacrament. So again, 3 things are going to basically blessings that will flow from that. These are also duties. These are also the intention to enter into these things. So they would be threefold, flowing from the bond. If you see the graphic, going to the right, you have procreation and education, which St. Augustine is going to say is offspring, and then mutual assistance, which St. Augustine is going to say is conjugal faith, the fact that this couple is yoked together to do certain duties. And then the sacramental nature. So these are the 3 things. In a sense, marriage is very simply defined. It is a permanent bond between a man and a woman, of course, bonded by God. And it's going to entail these 3 aspects, these 3 blessings: procreation, education, offspring, conjugal fidelity, mutual assistance, and sacramental nature. So in all the Casti Connubii videos, you're going to see that there's going to be a flow that the Pope is going to go through. He's first going to kind of give you definitions, lay out the premise of what marriage is, the nature and obligation of marriage. Then he's going to go into a section, kind of in the middle of the encyclical, he's going to go through the attacks against family and marriage. and point out some of the primary attacks, which I will highlight here. And then he's going to not just leave us hanging, but he's going to go and talk through some remedies, like how can we heal this? How can we strengthen marriage and family in our day? So now we're moving into those attacks. Of course, since this is on, I'm just going to kind of outline the major attacks on the bond and authority. So the major attack on the bond of marriage is, of course, going to be divorce. Because the church teaching is that the bond is indissoluble. It cannot be dissolved. It's not like a sugar cube that you put in a coffee and it just dissolves. It's not like that at all. It's more like a rock that you would put in that hot coffee that it's going to stay put. Divorce is an attack against the indissoluble bond of marriage, but also the authority that the state is going to say they have authority over this, or the couple themselves is going to say they have authority of it. So we'll kind of see how that plays out with those attacks. In section 49, to begin at the very source of these evils against marriage, their basic principle lies in this: that matrimony is repeatedly declared to be not instituted by the author of nature, nor raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a true sacrament, but invented by man. This is, of course, when we're talking about the bond and the authority, this is just stripping God away from that authority. Who gets to define what marriage is, what people will do within marriage, namely the obligations, and then whether a marriage exists or not, whether it can be dissolved or not. And so if you strip God away, if he is not the author of this institution, if he did not found it, and Jesus didn't elevate it to a sacrament, if it's neither a sacrament, nor if it is not a institution of God, then man gets to decide everything. And what does that leave us with? Well, that leaves us with either the couple gets to decide, they get to call all the shots, they get to define what it is and determine what they will do in it and whether it will be dissolved or not. And if the couple's not doing that, then of course the state is doing that. So man and or the state will fill the gap if you remove God from that situation. This is the major attack, and this is what really we have to focus on is what is this bond? Who gets to define it? Who has ultimate authority over it? Section 51. Some men go so far as to concoct new species of unions, suited, as they say, to the present temper of men and the times, which various new forms of matrimony they presume to label temporary, experimental, and companionate. These offer all the indulgence of matrimony and its rights, without, however, the indissoluble bond and without offspring. So this really is going to talking here about cohabitation. So if you have two people that are living together, and then let's say they're going to enjoy some of the duties and obligations of marriage, some of the rights of marriage, as it says here, indulging in matrimony. In other words, enjoying what matrimony gives without being married. And enjoying the matrimonial rights. So what would be some of those rights? And we'll talk about this in the other videos. You can see them here under mutual assistance. Living in the same home is a matrimonial right. Sleeping in the same bed is a matrimonial right. Having the intimacy, particularly of the sexual act, and then having that support of this one person. So there's a lot of different rights. And so when someone is living together, entering into the sexual act, you would have cohabitation there. You would have fornication, which is the sexual act without marriage. And then a lot of times what you have is contraception. You have some sort of contraception. And this is what the Holy Father is saying, is that they're entering into what looks like a marriage. However, it doesn't have a bond at all. And it's not going to be probably in that case open to life. So it is a mockery of what marriage is. So if two people are cohabitating, they're taking to themselves rights which they do not have yet. If you think of another sacrament that we have, holy orders, we would not be okay with a seminarian, for instance, taking the rights of priesthood without being ordained. So let's walk through that. If you have a seminarian that is starting to enjoy some of the rights of holy orders, for instance, hearing confessions, saying mass, going to the hospital to anoint the sick, If we had a seminarian that was doing that, if a seminarian was going around the diocese saying mass, hearing confessions, and anointing the sick, he would be reprimanded immediately. And there would actually be an outcry. We would say this is mocking holy orders. But it is very often to have, in our time, and again, this is talking about 100 years ago, people that will say, well, we need this temporary cohabitation, we need this experimental marriage, I want a companion, I want to save money, or for whatever reason, the two people begin to cohabitate. And then as they cohabitate, they enter into the rites of marriage. Perhaps this is for 9 months, perhaps it's for 3 years, perhaps it's for longer. But it should not, it is against the church teaching because, again, for the same reason that the seminarian could not act like a priest, a man and a woman cannot act like a married couple. They cannot do what a married couple only can do. So the man and the woman need to wait until they are in the bond, that bond according to the church, before they enter into those rights and the joys of marriage. So cohabitation would be one of the attacks against the bond because, and also the authority, because I guess in the way that works is the bond is temporary, experimental, and dissolvable. So cohabitation attacks the bond. And also the two people deciding, the man and the woman together deciding that they will take those rights, also goes against the authority of the church. Now we're going to talk about really further attacks on the bond, namely divorce. I first want to say that there is no such thing as divorce. If someone is in a bond, they are always in the bond. If they consented to everything that we mentioned before, offspring, sacrament, mutual assistance, if they meant what God meant and what Christ and his church meant, then that is a bond that cannot be dissolved. Now, the church does allow separation. When we're talking about divorce, typically we would be talking about a civil loosening of the civil rights that happen. So when someone gets married in the church, a state may recognize that marriage and give that couple certain rights. If that couple is going to get divorced, that's on the state side. In other words, the state is loosening their rights, their obligations according to the state. But there is no such thing as a divorce in the church, in the bond, because, again, you are either in the bond or not. I'm reminded of a story that, there's a husband and wife that was really influential, a married couple was very influential to me when I was a young man. And I remember the husband, the dad, saying that one time he was driving his daughter home from school, and the daughter said something like, "Are you and mom going to get a divorce? Would you and mom ever get a divorce?" And he said, where did you hear that word? And she explained that there was a kid at school that their parents were going through a divorce, and this girl his daughter had never heard the word, never knew what it was. So she heard it at school, and he just simply said to her, "Never say that word again. That is not an option ever. That will never happen." And he actually said, "Don't even say that word." And this has been very important to me and my wife, that the word divorce is never mentioned in our home. It is never an option. It is never a threat. It's never joked. There's never sarcasm. It's just divorce would be a mockery to the bond that we are in. And so this is how divorce is not an option. Let me just say it that way. So what if there is trouble within a marriage? What do two people do? The church does allow separation, and we have the 1917 Code of Canon Law. For in certain circumstances, imperfect separation of the parties is allowed. Now, what he means by imperfect separation here would be a period of time to work things out. So imperfect separation of the parties is allowed. The bond not being severed, that's important. This separation, which the church herself permits and expressly mentions in her canon law, in those canons which deal with the separation of the parties as to the marital relationship and cohabitation, removes all the alleged inconveniences and dangers. So what is the point of separation? What is it doing? And what is the point? What is it doing? It's going to remove the two people for a time period. I believe 6 months would be what the church recommends. And so two people are having trouble with their marriage, and things are getting serious. There's serious trouble. The first thing they don't go to is divorce. And this is, I think, a problem in our society is once two people start having problems, they don't go to the church. They should. That should be the first place they go to. They should go to the church. They should go to their priest, and they should start working these things out. Many times what happens is they go to a secular counselor and they're recommended just to get a divorce. Or they start talking to their friends and someone says, well, just get a divorce, as if there are no other options. Remember, divorce is not an option. And so what needs to happen is if there is a troubled, unhappy marriage and there's some serious problems, go to the church. Go to the place that first put you in the bond. Go to the church, and the church will then, if needed, allow a time of separation. What's the point of that? The point of that is to work out these inconveniences, to work out these problems, and also to avoid any danger. If there's a spouse that's in danger, maybe of abuse, or children that are in danger, separation is going to be necessary, whether it's physical abuse, emotional abuse, or whatever. So it's what the separation is going to allow the inconveniences to stop for a period of time and the danger to stop for a period of time. And then what's going to be given up during this time is going to be the marital relationship, which is the sexual act, and also living under the same roof, cohabitation. So the separation is intentional. It's meant to truly be a separation. These two people will not be with each other intimately. They will not be under the same roof, and they will enter into a time really of penance, of prayer, of working with the church to solve the problems and to respect the bond that they are in. So this would be the first place you go, not to a divorce. And that's not what we see happening in our society. The Holy Father here is saying directly what the church would like, and that's to go to the church first, separate if needed, give yourself a period of time to work these things out. Now, in my own life, my own experience, my mother and father-in-law, actually, this happened with them. They did get a secular divorce, but they still knew they were bonded together by the church. They had a period of time in which they were separated. I believe it was 9 months. They ended up working out their differences, and they did get back together. Of course, they never had to remarry in the church because they were never divorced in the church. There is no such thing as divorce. So even though they did get a secular divorce, they ended up working it out over a period of time. So in this case, the separation did solve the problem. They remarried, and they actually then had my wife. So I'm very thankful that they just did not go quickly to the divorce route and then maybe even enter into another marriage or whatever. In section 89, the Pope is going to talk about the major reason people go immediately to divorce. And he's going to say that adultery, which is this reason, is not a reason for divorce or to dissolve the bond. And neither are other excuses that could be weaker excuses, is what he says. If, therefore, the church has not erred and does not err in teaching this, and consequently it is certain that the bond of marriage cannot be loosed even on account of the sin of adultery. So I want to stress that. The church teaches that the marriage bond cannot be loosed even on the account of the sin of adultery. It is evident that all the other weaker excuses that can be and are usually brought forward are of no value whatsoever. There is no such thing as divorce. The bond cannot be loosened. Either there is a bond or there is not. And so even when the sin of adultery occurs or any other thing that could come up, any weaker excuse, as the Pope says, these are not grounds for divorce. There is either a bond or not. Again, what happens if someone is just like, well, we've separated, and even through separation, we seem to not be able to reconcile. We seem to not be able to work things out. What happens then? Well, it would be prudent then at that point, after a period of separation, after working with the church and truly working, putting as much effort into it, at that point, then to look into the bond, look into, were there any ingredients missing? Were there any grounds for an annulment? And going to the church at that point again to say, was this a failed marriage, an attempted marriage that is truly null and void? And that's where the annulment process comes in. Annulment is not a Catholic divorce. Annulment is simply a declaration that there were impediments to the bond. In other words, there were ingredients missing at the bond, so therefore there was no bond. I've said that over and over again, but either there is a bond or there is not, and the supreme authority over that bond, whether it's there or not, is the church. Pius XI is now going to quote Leo XIII, and this is in paragraph 91, or section 91. He's going to talk about how divorce does have a ripple effect. It doesn't just affect individuals, the man and the woman, but it affects their children, their grandchildren, and it also affects the state. So the state does need to be involved here and be concerned about this attack against the bond of marriage. The loss of national wealth is brought about more by the corruption of morals than by anything else. It is easily seen that divorce, which is born of the perverted morals of a people and leads, as an experiment shows, to vicious habits in public and private life, is particularly opposed to the well-being of the family and of the state. This goes back to the very first thing he said at the beginning of the encyclical, which is the society will go as family goes and family will go as marriage goes. Marriage is dependent on that bond. So if divorce is constantly attacking that bond, it will have its ripple effect on society. And particularly here, he talks about even the national wealth, the happiness of that society. In section 91, he's going to continue to quote Leo XIII. Once divorce has been allowed, there will be no sufficient means of keeping it in check within the definitive bounds. Great is the force of example, greater still that of lust, and with such incitements, it cannot but happen that divorce and its consequent setting loose of the passions should spread daily and attack the souls of many like a contagious disease or a river bursting its banks and flooding the land. We can definitely see that this has happened in our society, that once you just have a small little crack at attempting to attack that bond, it just busts wide open. Again, like a river that can't even be contained. And we see this in our own society. If you look at maybe our grandparents or great-grandparents, for instance, I'm almost 50 years old. If I look at my grandparents' generation that were probably getting married in the 40s and 50s, they did have the mentality that there is no such thing as divorce. And also at that time, the state did not have no-fault divorce. So you had, according to the state, you had to have a very, very good or serious reason to get a divorce. But the mentality of the people were, there is no such thing as divorce. Once you're married, you're always married. We're in this until death. You only get one shot at this. And that was the mentality then in the 40s and 50s. This encyclical was written in the 30s. Now we see with no-fault divorce, our country allowed no-fault divorce in the 60s. And so now we're about, 60 years later, we see that people will get divorced for whatever reason, just at a blink of an eye. It is so easy to loosen this bond. One time a couple asked, they were married civilly, and they asked me, why should I get married in the church? And I said simply, I think the Holy Spirit kind of inspired me to say this, but I said, well, how easy do you want to get out of this? And that really is a good way to think about this too. How easy do you want to get out of the bond? Because if two people are cohabitating, it's extremely easy to get out of the bond. In our society right now, if two people are civilly married, if you're just married by the justice of the peace, it is super easy to get out of that bond. And that's actually what the Pope is saying here, that this is going to just continue, and then for whatever reason, people can just go ahead and dissolve this bond. If you get married in the church, and you intend what the church intends, and there are no impediments, it is impossible to get out of the bond. The only way that the bond is no longer is through death, until death do us part. So now we will get into actually the remedies. How do we fix these problems regarding especially the bond and the authority? Well, we have to return back to seeing the church as the supreme authority over every single marriage on planet Earth. He, God, has constituted the church the guardian and the teacher of the whole of the truth concerning religion and moral conduct. Marriage fits into religion and moral conduct. To her, therefore, to her, therefore, should the faithful show obedience and subject their minds and hearts so as to be kept unharmed and free from error and moral corruption. So the church is key to really marriage working well. It's the key to the remedy. Remember, the Holy Father said that the major attack on marriage is that you do not respect the authority of the church over this institution and this sacrament. So obviously the remedy would be returning back to the fact that the church is the supreme authority over this institution and this sacrament. So how can that be played out, especially among those preparing for marriage and those that are married? Well, if you're preparing for marriage, then go to your local priest, your local parish, and under your bishop, and prepare for marriage. At least where I'm at, the bishop has to approve every single marriage, and people go through marriage preparation. So one way you can show the authority and remedy this whole thing is make sure you marry in the church. If you are Catholic, it is a precept of the church that you marry in the church. In other words, you're obligated to marry in the church. What does that imply? That also implies these days being prepared by your church, by your pastor, or by your priest, by his staff or whatever. Usually the diocese also has some programs. So that's one way. What about a married couple? How can they show the respect to the church on this matter? Well, they can continue to live out the teachings of the church. In other words, no use of contraception, being open to life, being respectful to each other, and all the things that the church says that this sacrament should entail. What happens if there is an unhappy marriage or people are struggling? They should go back to the church that prepared them and that married them, and they should work out this with the church, even if separation is necessary. And then what happens if the separation doesn't even work and the couple, either one or both, feels like this truly was a failed marriage? They maybe even doubt that the bond even existed. Again, the answer is go to the church, go through the annulment process, and bring this situation to the church and have the church have the final say, because the church is the final authority over whether there is a bond or there is not a bond. In section 106, welded into a power of hierarchical apostolate, you, the bishops, may, by every fitting mean, oppose error by truth, vice by the excellent dignity of chastity, the slavery of covetousness by the liberty of the sons of God, that disastrous ease in obtaining divorce by an enduring love in the bond of marriage, and by an inviolate pledge of fidelity given even to death. I really like this because what the Pope is saying here to his bishops is that this is a welded power together, that the bishops, the priests, the deacons, the lay people, those that are confirmed, connected to the bishop, should be welded together to make sure that they give people every hope, every skill, every truth, and make sure that people are prepared for marriage and people are strengthened within marriage. And this is actually what is taking place in dioceses around the world. And so by every fitting means, this could be retreats, this could be classes at your parish, this could be videos like I'm doing now, and courses like I'm doing now, whatever fitting mean takes necessary to combat these errors with truth, express the truth and the beauty and the goodness of what marriage is, both as an institution and a sacrament, to promote chastity and the dignity of chastity, not just the slavery of sexual sins and all that, but help people to be chaste and live a chaste life. Again, to live out our baptismal vows, not to return to our formal slavery, but be truly liberated by being sons of God through our baptism and the other sacraments. And then really combating the ease of divorce by two things: a pledge of fidelity until death and an enduring love. That through this sacrament, people, a man and a woman, can be perfected by love, this mutual assistance, this charity towards one another. So in that section, we talked about really what the church can do for those preparing, what the church can do for the faithful. What is it that the individuals can do? What can two people preparing for marriage do? And what also can someone like myself that's been married for almost 25 years do? And now in section 115, the Pope is going to tell us, they should, in so deliberating, keep before their minds the thought first of God, and of the true religion of Christ. First and foremost, what should be on everyone's mind, whether you're preparing for marriage or you are married, is what does God say about this, and what does the church say about this? So, what does God and the church say about how I prepare? What does God and the church say about my bond and what it takes to be in a bond? What the necessary pieces are. We've already talked about those. What does the church say about whether I can loosen the bond or not? How I should handle it if there's trouble in the marriage? How I should handle it if I believe that this is a failed marriage? Again, always first asking not what I think, but what does God in His church think? What does that do? That shows that they have the proper authority over this bond. And then after that, after thinking of God and the church, then we think about ourselves. We think, what am I going to bring to this marriage? What am I bringing to this marriage? What about my partner? What about this person that I'm going to marry or I am married to? Then thinking about the children, thinking about the future children, thinking about the current children if you're already married. And then how does this impact society? Because my marriage is not my marriage. My marriage is for my wife. My marriage is for the church. My marriage is for my kids. My marriage is for society. My marriage is even for you if you're watching this video. I remember a priest once said that his priesthood was not his priesthood. His priesthood was for God. It was for the church. It was for society. It was for the faithful. And so we have to then think about our marriage as not my marriage. We think of God and Christ first, and the church. We think of our spouse. We think of ourselves. We think of our children, and we think of society. That's what we can do as we prepare and as we continue to endure in this beautiful sacrament. In section 123, the Pope's going to talk about what the state can do. So the individual has its part, the church has their part. Now, what is the state? How should the state be involved in this? First and foremost, the state should not overstep their area. They should not try to take away or diminish in any way the authority of the church over this sacrament. So what should they do? As history testifies, the prosperity of the state and the temporal happiness of its citizens cannot remain safe and sound where the foundation on which they are established, which is the moral order, is weakened, and where the very fountainhead from which the state draws its life, namely wedlock, and the family is obstructed by the vices of its citizens. So, marriage is important to the state, so the state must care about this institution. The state, therefore, needs to recognize the beauty of this institution, but respect that this is God's institution and this is the church's sacrament. So the state cannot usurp the authority. They cannot define this institution. They cannot call this institution their own. They cannot make the rules or define this. We've seen this, unfortunately, in our own time with so-called same-sex marriage, where the states or the country or whatever, country after country, has said, redefined marriage as between a man and a man or a woman and a woman. This is something that probably 100 years ago the Pope would never have even envisioned would happen. But again, once the state oversteps its bounds and oversteps its authority, then in a sense anything goes. Marriage does not need to change at all by definition, because God does not make mistakes. Also, as a sacrament, we don't need to add to or diminish from the 7 sacraments. The sacraments have been instituted by Christ. In this case, this was elevated to the level of a sacrament by Christ. So there is nothing wrong with the way it is defined, the way it operates. And so we don't want to touch marriage. So in short, the state doesn't need to touch this. It just needs to recognize the dignity of it and recognize the church's authority over it. And this will bring about the prosperity of the state and the temporal happiness of its citizens. If the state meddles in this or tries to usurp the church's authority on this, there will be the opposite effect. There will be harm done, and the citizens will not be happy with the result. In section 125, Pope Leo XIII is going to be quoted again. The founder of the church, Jesus Christ, wished the spiritual power to be distinct from the civil, and each to be free and unhampered in doing its own work. If the civil power combines in a friendly manner with the spiritual power of the church, it necessarily follows that both parties will greatly benefit. The dignity of the state will be enhanced, And with religion as its guide, there will never be a rule that is not just. While for the church, there will be at hand a safeguard and defense which will operate to the public good of the faithful. Here again, that church has its place, state has its place. Who determines these places and these roles? It's determined by God. God definitely has a reason and a role for the state, and obviously has a reason and a role for the church. And so they should be friendly to each other and support each other, but never overstep their bounds. And this is going to be the good for all, and this is how things should operate. I may have said this before, I don't remember if I said it in this video, but when we are dealing with the 7 sacraments, and when we are dealing with things instituted by God, then we do not hand those things over to the state. For example, I do not go to confession to the mayor of my city. We don't allow our governor to appoint or ordain the next bishop of a diocese. So we don't hand over holy orders to the state. We don't go to confession to our mayor. We don't receive communion at the local restaurant. We don't hand over sacraments to the state. We don't hand over institutions to the state that have been divinely ordained, divinely instituted. And so why would we hand over this sacrament, this institution that goes all the way back to the beginning? Why would we hand that over to the state? We don't. And not only should we not hand over to the state, which we don't, but we, as individual faithful, as individuals, we should not be okay with that. We are not okay with going to the justice of the peace, for instance. A Catholic must marry in the church because the church is, again, the supreme authority over that on planet Earth, and Christ has entrusted this sacrament to his church. So God is the one that has